Our third speaker is Peter Tse of the Department of Psychology and Psychological and Brain Sciences at Dartmouth College. Peter Tse.
Can you hear me? All right, well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor also to speak after Steve was, I remember now, a professor in a class I took at Harvard 25 years ago, so time has flown. I don't know how much progress we have made as a field in the past 25 years, and in a way, it seems like we've made quite a lot. In a way, we haven't made much at all. I would say we have not yet had our Darwin, and we certainly haven't had our Watson and Crick yet. We're something like 1850s or maybe 1750s level science and neuroscience compared to, say, biology. And what I mean by that, Darwin gave us an overarching broad idea that unified all of thinking in biology. And then Watson and Crick cracked the code. We're a long way, I think, from cracking the neural code or any of the neural codes. So there are some very deep fundamental problems that haven't been solved yet. One being the neural code or neural codes. Another being how can mental events be causal at all? You know, if we operate under an assumption of physicalism, why doesn't all causation seep down to the bottommost level of atoms hitting atoms or quarks or strings or whatever you think is most fundamental? That is also a hard problem, mental causation. And then the neural basis of consciousness, including this hard problem. So I actually spent the past 25 years or so trying to figure out what goes into the kinds of computations that result in consciousness in the visual domain. So for example, you see a dot up here, and some time later you experience the dot. It turns out that that lag is probably on the order of 1/4 of a second to even 1/3 of a second. And in that 1/4 to 1/3 of a second, an enormous amount of processing goes on. And that processing is remarkable. It can result in some people's brains in a blue-looking dress or a white-looking dress. So I initially thought that simply by focusing on those kinds of very rapid analyses and operations, we could probably figure out why consciousness seems the way it does. And I no longer believe that. I think we have to go far beyond. Let me just say, I think that in my field of cognitive neuroscience and cognitive science, there's been a huge emphasis on sort of the nouns of the mind. Maybe Gary was saying it's the concrete nouns of the mind, things like objects, faces, houses, scenes, and so forth. And there's been much less work on the verbs of the mind, these sort of operations. Some of those operations are very rapid, bottom-up, driven by the stimulus. Others are top-down, volitional sorts of things, choosing to see the old woman versus the young woman. And so there's this interplay between bottom-up and top-down operations. My own view of consciousness now is that it is a domain of very highly precompiled, highly pre-interpreted representations, which are the operands for top-down volitional operators, the king of which or the queen of which is volitional attention. So you can choose now to shift your volitional attention to my voice or to maybe the pressure of the chair against your back. And the world hasn't changed. What has changed is how you're operating upon the world. So it turns out there's this very deep connection, I think, between three concepts: volition, attention, and consciousness. And that's the relationship of an operator to its operands, or function to its arguments. And the purpose of this thing, this domain that we call consciousness, is so that we can act in the world, find mates, shelter, food, and so forth, and plan. Now, initially, I thought that that was all that consciousness is about. But then it dawned on me that consciousness is actually kind of bifurcated. It has a dual role. There's sort of two main purposes. One is to give you a world and your body in that world. So we experience our body in this world, and we see a scene, we feel hungry, and so forth. And then there's this other side to consciousness, which is our internal imagination. So there's a psychologist called Jonathan Schooler who gave people a buzzer, and he buzzed them and found that basically half the time we go through the world sort of operating consciously aware of the outside world and our bodies in it, and the other half of the time we're daydreaming and fantasizing and so forth. And I would argue that this second domain of consciousness is really where humans took off. So if you look at the fossil and artifact record, which is really all we have because thoughts don't leave fossils and feelings don't leave fossils and words don't leave fossils, if you look at the artifact record, the first tools arise about 2.2 million years ago with Homo habilis, and they're basically just rocks that were smashed together. And then come the Acheulean axes of the Homo erectus, ancestors of ours. And what's really striking about them is that they didn't change for over 1 million years. It's almost like we were bowerbirds that had this sort of template to build this particular kind of axe, and you find them all over. So what's really amazing is how uninnovative they were. And you could even say that for much later species like Neanderthals that had the Mousterian tool set, which also didn't change over tens and tens of thousands of years. So something happened, I think, in our lineage such that we could create imaginary objects like the Löwenmensch in Germany, where 30, 40,000 years ago, where you have a lion's head and a human body. Somebody had to think of that first before going and building it. So something happened in our imaginations in the second domain of consciousness that was really revolutionary. I could say to you, for example, imagine a golden egg with wings flying around the Statue of Liberty who's holding an ice cream cone instead of a torch. Poof, you can do that. I could have said anything. Now you can do that, and now you can carry out mental operations over that. Now make the egg fly around, and you can do that too, right? So these operations are not only operating pre-consciously, giving us consciousness. In the second domain of consciousness, we can operate on those things and create imagined things. So I want to argue that there are, as awesome as AI is now, it has yet to really solve three main things. One is the issue of mental operations. Right? We can classify if something's a mane or a monet very well, but can we do mental operations even as simple as mental rotation? Another is mental models, which are very central to human cognition. And the other is consciousness. Those three things. So here I want to mention the work of Tolman back in the 1930s. The reigning thinking at that time was the thinking of the behaviorists, such as Skinner, who argue that we're just input-output devices. Now Tolman does this work where he trains rats to go through these mazes, and they can find the food with enough training. But then he had the insight of giving them free rein, and they would make a beeline for the food. They took a shortcut, and he inferred from that already back in 1930 that there must be mental models or cognitive maps in the rat, which I think was the beginning of a major crack in the edifice of behaviorism. So mental maps are very central to our own processing. Here's another example, if this would work. Okay, so maybe you've heard of this famous story of Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, the dog that didn't bark. So Scotland Yard could not solve who had murdered Mr. X. So they bring in the brilliant Sherlock Holmes, and he simply asks, did the dog bark? And they said, why no, it did bark. Aha, well then it had to be a person whom the dog knew, right? So a complete absence of information can be informative for a human because we have a mental model about how dogs work. And I doubt that a complete absence of input could be informative to most present computer systems. So having mental models allows us to see essentially a reality behind even the invisible, such as chains of causation. Other things that are invisible would be the backs of things. You know, say you're a monkey, well, you can't grab the branch only where it's visible. You have to grab it where it's invisible. You have to have a full model, or you'll fall to your death. I'll give you another example. You know, so mental models allow us to see the invisible. I was with my wife, actually. We went to a party, and we left the party, and she said, I know that the host is having an affair with that other woman. And I said, well, how do you know, honey? It's ridiculous. We don't even know these people. She says, did you see how he took the beer from her and he didn't even say thank you? So that so the absence of information for her, she said, well, you would only be so rude and with someone with whom you're intimate. So then I did some, and she was right. I said, God, that's incredible. How can you have seen the invisible there? But she had a mental model about how other minds work. All right. Right, and if I were to come home, say, with the wrong color hair on my sweater, that would be a big deal, right? Because in her mental model, that could have all kinds of implications, right? So an AI system is going to zoom in on something just as information, but for her, it implies a whole mental model. All right, okay, so then show some examples like Heather did, I would say a mental model is implicit in our conscious experience. So those two bits with the arrows there are identical in the image, and I can prove that, but if I go back, I'm sorry, yeah, you can see, you can't access the color in the image. Here, you probably experience these things as lying on a ground plane. If I rotate the image 90 degrees, though, they seem now to be next to each other and radically taller. So we don't have access to the building of the model. It comes fully formed to us. All right, here's another point. A lot of our mental models, though, are dependent upon our conscious experience, right? And one of the most important and invisible things that we're modeling are other people's minds, and we can actually empathize with people and experience what they're experiencing through our mental models of them based upon our experience. So I can look at somebody like him who is heartbroken, and I know what it's like because I've been heartbroken. And that ability to model that is rooted in my conscious experience of having been in that situation. So lacking consciousness, no computer is going to be able to model that. And so I think we're way off. I don't think we can solve the problem of deep AI short of solving the deeper problem of consciousness. So I'll end with this question. Without consciousness and our mental models that are based on it, will AI be able to process the invisible or the inaudible? Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions, and maybe I'll use my chair prerogative and ask the first one to David. Because I've often wondered whether a way of cracking the so-called hard problem of consciousness would be to ask what would it take for an artificial system that was behaviorally intelligent to wonder about the hard problem of consciousness. But could that, let's say we did the experiment, we had a social robot, and in interrogating it about everything we know about consciousness, it said, yeah, but you forgot this thing that I feel that I'm conscious, and that's not explained by any of the information processing in neurobiological theories. Could one then still domesticate that to the easy problem by saying that some report of subjectivity, which inevitably relates to a state that is equivalent to the state of the person asking the question, could itself be a kind of strategy to induce empathy by saying whatever your goal stack is, I got the same one, so whatever regard you have for yourself, you should have to me. One could still ask the question, yeah, but is the robot who is deploying that strategy claiming it's conscious in order to equate its state with someone else's? Is it really feeling anything? Did that just push it back back to the hard problem all over again?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting hypothesis really about maybe the functional purpose of these descriptions of consciousness. You could easily put it in an evolutionary context. It does seem that consciousness, for us at least, we treat as a marker of moral status. If someone or something is conscious, we have to take them more seriously insofar as you think, for example, that fish are conscious and can feel pain, then at least they enter the circle of beings we have to at least care about if we're hurting them. Maybe they don't matter as much. But consciousness is what makes you matter. So maybe, so from this perspective, then attributing consciousness to each other was very important in order to get ourselves to take each other seriously. Hey, I matter because I'm conscious. And you could tell an evolutionary story about how we managed to contribute to each other this sense of being conscious for mattering. I mean, empathy would be one part of that. It wouldn't necessarily be the only part of that. So I suppose if you did take that idea seriously, then for a machine to generate these reports, it would have to have this within us, views about what matters and views of strategies about how to matter. It would probably be very deeply unconscious and implicit, as it is in us. But the key thing, I think, is that whatever the basis is for that, whether it's a matter, I think my own view is this is only a limited story, but what makes this happen is actually we have self-models within us that very deeply generate these intuitions about consciousness. But the key thing is that if consciousness is real, the basis of those reports should also be the basis of consciousness. You think, we shouldn't take it seriously because it's just a strategy in the machines. Hey, it's just a strategy in you and me too.
Exactly. That's why it's hard. Exactly. Okay, here, Gary.
I have a variation of Steve's question, but I'll ask it of Peter instead. Is there a mic? So my variation on Steve's question for Peter. There's a class of people, it seems to me, that do some of the things that you want your machines to do. And yet I don't think it sort of answers the consciousness question. So you have people like psychopaths that can have theories of other people without having certain sets of genuine emotions themselves. And my question for you, given that as a background, is like, why do you think you need to be conscious in order to do the kind of theory of mind stuff that you talked about, as opposed to just having a theory like you would have a theory about, say, physics and how physics works? So if you're going to have a theory of people, you need to know that people have beliefs and desires and they act on those beliefs, and Steve had lots of examples of that in his talk. But why do you need to be conscious to do any of that? Why can't it just be kind of domain of expertise? And okay, it's a little bit harder because you have to understand language. Current AI doesn't do that. But if you had AI systems that could understand language, then why can't they just reason about another class of entities without being conscious?
Right, right. Well, first of all, psychopaths are conscious, and yet they lack a certain kind of operation, the empathy operations. So,
but they can emulate them, is my point.
But they can emulate them, but it's as if I can make models of the weather, but they don't have wind in them either.
Exactly. So why should this be any different? It's just like modeling the weather without having the weather in you. Like, why do you need consciousness to do the modeling and prediction? Like,
right. So I think what centrally goes into the construction of consciousness by these, especially by these operations that are pre-conscious and unconscious, and are very rapid in the bottom-up stream, processing stream, is the recovery of what is intrinsically true about things. So, for example, I want to recover the intrinsic pigment of something. Let's say, what gray value the paint is. Well, at the retina, that I recover some number, say 10 out of 100. Well, some percentage of that could be due to the pigment, to smoke, transparency, the illuminant shadows. How do I recover the pigment given this incredible ambiguity? I can't unless I have this model about how to recover the image to the world mapping. But the goal of all that processing is to recover what's intrinsically true. What's intrinsically true of pigment, shape, size, and so forth. But I would add to that, some of it is in the domain of social processing. I'm trying to recover what is intrinsically true of other people's minds, right? So we have signaling systems that we have evolved, like smiling and crying and so forth. And that allows me to recover the invisible, namely their minds. And then I have this essentially model of the world, which you might take as a kind of hallucination, but it's a veridical hallucination, and it is the world. It's so good that it's as if I'm processing the world in itself, but it's not the world in itself.
I think you're giving an argument, this will be the last thing I say, for having a different kind of AI than we have right now, but not for consciousness. So the argument that you're making is an argument for why AI needs to be model-based rather than, say, learning correlations between pixels. And I'm 100% sympathetic with that. So I'm also very sympathetic with everything you said about operations and all these kinds of things I think are important. They're left out of today's AI models, but you could build AI models, occasionally people do this in narrow domains, that have representations that reconstruct models of what's going on in the world. So we do that with a GPS or something like that. It's not that we can't do it, it's that we don't know how to do it in general way.
We can't do it. I mean, we're physical systems, and I think, other physical systems could, in principle, realize this. But we don't even know how it's realized in us yet. So to go and build these other systems that emulate our model building and our mental operations and our conscious experience, I don't know if it's premature, but I would like to focus on this system first.
I've always been caught by, and I'd like your criticism or where you feel like there's future potential in the memory prediction framework, where you think about the hierarchical structure of the cortex, and to your point about intrinsic truth, where presumably capturing a state of the world and then extrapolating, making a prediction. If you see my funky shoes, you see me. You make a prediction when you see the shoes that you will then see me. When you don't, you have a surprise. Emotion plays a role in imprinting the salience of that new information. Could consciousness be the other layer on top of that, where it's the prediction about our predictions, the sort of meta layer on top of the memory prediction framework?
I'll speak since I haven't spoken. I think that you're putting a lot of emphasis on these things. Like, first of all, you can have consciousness without even thoughts about self, without even making predictions, without even memories. You know, there's people with brain lesions who have memory for a minute. And this one patient in particular keeps writing every minute, I'm now just conscious for the very first time. I'm now just conscious for the very first time, and has no sense of the past or the future. So a lot of the theories around consciousness that we build are based on our experience of it, which I like to look at it when I see patients that have lesions where you get these dissociations and breakups. And the one fundamental thing that we can see, you don't need language, you don't need sense of self, you don't need memory. You don't need really intelligence. It's just pure subjective sensation if you break it down to its bare essentials, okay? Just feeling a sensation of pain, not even the fact of like a meta-consciousness, oh, it's me who's feeling the pain, or that pain reminds me of that time I had that toothache. Just feeling it, just seeing the color, you know, a baby. And then, you know, it leads us to these questions. What we ultimately need and what we're lacking is a fundamental theory of consciousness so we can make predictions about what has it and what doesn't. So does my baby in utero have it? At what point does it feel things? At what point will this AI system? It's not even about building an AI system that necessarily will have it. For me, it's more of a question of how will we know when it has it? And the only way to really know is if we can agree upon a fundamental theory of consciousness so we can measure it or predict that a certain system has it.
So I completely agree with Heather about separating just simple raw consciousness from these reflective processes of reflecting on consciousness. On the other hand, just say you're not trying to model consciousness, you're trying to model our models of consciousness. You're trying to understand our models of consciousness. Then I think precisely what you were saying may have a role to play. For example, thinking about what kind of subjective experience am I going to have next. This is something that we're all used to. We have complicated models of our subjective experience in our head, and that may be that the predictive framework has something to say about that higher order question, that is about the meta problem, if not directly about the hard problem.
So I'm